Vladimir Putin's factually wrong when he contends that his unprovoked invasion of Ukraine was a, quote, defensive measure against U.S.-led aggression. The West is not at war against Russia. That said, NATO is no longer exactly sitting idle. No direct confrontation, but 15 months on, ratcheted up support for Ukraine has morphed into an East versus West test of battle readiness that's brought the two sides closer to active combat than arguably at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. At 3 a.m. on Tuesday morning, Kyiv time, Russia threw its most powerful hypersonic missiles, the Kinzhals, at the U.S.'s most sophisticated anti-aircraft batteries, the Patriots. We'll ask about the conflicting claims over who got the better of whom and who will actually control the skies once a Ukrainian counteroffensive goes into high gear. While Ukraine pleads for jets, the Western press highlights dysfunction inside the Kremlin and on the battlefield. Fog of war? Does Moscow still have a lot in the tank? Fact is, both sides face major challenges in the days and weeks ahead. Today in the France 24 debate, we're talking about the battle for air supremacy. Joining us from the Ukrainian capital, Peter Zalmayev, director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Former French ambassador to Russia, Claude Blanche-Maison, is with us. How are you?
Good evening.
Samantha de Bender, associate fellow at the think tank Chatham House.
Good evening.
And from Zaporizhzhia, France 24, senior correspondent Catherine Norris-Trent. How are you doing, Catherine?
Hi, Francois. I'm very well, thank you.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Catherine, you're in the south of Ukraine, the other side of the front line from Europe's largest nuclear power plant.
Yeah, that's right. We're in the city of Zaporizhzhia, and we've come here because, there's been a lot of speculation. This could be one of the possible locations for any future offensive by Ukraine. It's at a strategic point because south of here, southeast, you've got the zone around Orikhiv, which is a town once home to 15,000 people. Now, more than 90% of those have gone. The town's been hit hard for the past year, but it's really intensified now. The people there tell us that they've been being pounded by shelling, but more recently by bombs dropped by Russian warplanes, and so they're living mainly underground at the moment. This area has seen a lot of speculation about whether, as I said, it could be the site of a future assault. So we want to see some of the remaining people living in these villages just a few kilometers away from the front line, and they are hoping, Francois, that this push does happen soon so they can get the front line a little further away from their homes. Take a look at our report, which we filmed with Johan Baudin and Dmytro Kovalchuk. Barely a day has gone by without bombing here for more than a year. We're down near Ukraine's southern front line in the Zaporizhzhia region, where towns and villages lie mostly abandoned. Only a fraction of the population remains. Russian troops are 5 kilometers away. During lulls in fighting, emergency services hand out rations of bread and water. 69-year-old Maria is particularly war-weary as she waits in line.
I only got 2 loaves today. Sometimes the firemen bring more. But you have to come. Come and film my house.
What remains of her home in this ghost town with no running water or electricity has just been hit for the second time.
It wasn't like this the first time my house was shelled. The windows were just blasted out. But this time the walls are falling down too. I never saw anything like this before. It's so scary.
Her house was blasted by a 500-kilo bomb which landed in her neighbor's garden. For the past few weeks, Russian warplanes have been pounding the zone, and here there's no air defense system so close to the front line.
I want at least for the Ukrainian army to push them away from the villages around here, because it's almost like the Russians are sitting in our gardens, and they'll have to push them away fast, because by the time they're finally ready and prepared, there'll be nothing left of Orikhiv.
Trapped in the middle of artillery battles and living in constant fear of warplanes, the people who remain in these frontline villages are huddled down. And they're surviving off humanitarian aid. These rural southern plains are a prime strategic location and could be ripe for a looming ground assault. Amid all the talk of a possible Ukrainian counteroffensive, the bombings here near the Zaporizhzhia front line have intensified. And the people that remain here tell us they are really eager for that push to begin.
Catherine, what you describe in that report is also what they're living around liberated Kherson, further south. You talk about people forced to live underground in those frontline villages. Behind you, we see there's quite a bit of evening traffic.
Yeah, this is a kind of rush hour, I suppose, in Zaporizhzhia, with people coming home from work at the moment. You know, that there are still people in this zone. It's a major city in southeastern Ukraine. Some have left, of course. A lot of panic initially about what would happen to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Russian-occupied territory in the town of Enohada on the other side of the Dnieper River. But yeah, there's still people here, and they've become kind of accustomed, as many people have throughout Ukraine, to living with air raid alerts, living with deadly bombings. You know, we heard these Shahid drones flying over the city the other night. Unfortunately, it's become part of life for people. But it's really interesting, though, because people you speak to, you know, the other day we heard a sortie of Ukrainian fighter planes. They still have some aviation, and everyone stopped still to listen. And the waiter, where we were having lunch, said, just get us some more fighter planes and then we'll be okay. And it's not just President Zelensky and Ukrainian officials saying this. People know that at any time they could be hit. Ukraine's air defense has been widely praised and people are very proud of it, but they're still deeply worried about the threat from the air.
Samantha de Bender, this is one of the questions, one of the mysteries, you might say. February of last year, when Russia starts its all-out offensive, it was, we in the West think when there's a war that you take out the other side's air defenses, the other side's air force. You just heard Catherine say there's still Ukrainian fighter jets in the sky.
There's still Ukrainian fighter jets. What was really interesting is at the very beginning of the war, around February 24th, 25th, one of the main goals of the Russians was to get the military airbase of Hostomel just outside Kiev. And they thought, we will get this, we will take over the airbase, and then we will land our planes, and we will basically have invaded Kiev. And the Ukrainian army put up an incredible defense of Hostomel, and also say some of its own planes. But yes, Ukraine does not have enough planes. And without planes, they will not be able to really push back Russians from their territory. And as I've said on this program a number of times, I've been working on NATO-Ukraine relations for a very long time. I worked in NATO headquarters as what was called a NATO-Ukraine officer. And NATO always had this very ambivalent attitude towards Ukraine. Is that, well, we can't really accept Ukraine in NATO because that will annoy the Russians, but we have to help Ukraine because Ukraine wants to be part of the West. So what do we do? There's been a lot of sitting on the fence. And my point of view from day one has been, if we're going to help Ukraine, we have to go in and help them with as much as we can, as fast as we can, to save lives. Or else we just do nothing but drip feeding weapons. And yes, the West has been very generous, but it has been a drip feed. It has always been in reaction to what Russia has done, never proactive. And this drip feeding is what is prolonging the war more than anything else.
Do you agree? Is it a drip feed?
Well, probably it was the thing to do when at that time when Ukraine was a country with its border recognized by everybody, including Russia. I think probably the reaction of Russia at that time, taking Ukraine within NATO, would have been probably rather mild. But today it's impossible, because Ukraine is at war, it is a divided country, and we cannot import the war inside NATO. And that's quite clear. The limit put by Joe Biden since the very beginning of this war is, I don't want America to be at war with Russia, because Russia is a nuclear power, and it's impossible for the US and then, therefore, for NATO to be at war with Russia. So we are now in a deadlock with this huge front, war front of more than 800 kilometers, which makes it impossible to have enough troops, both sides, by the way, to keep really this front. And with some hotspot like Bakhmut, maybe we are going to say a word about Bakhmut, and also the nuclear power of...
Near where Catherine is right now,
yeah,
in Zaporizhzhia.
exactly, Zaporizhzhia. And as Zaporizhzhia is concerned, it's very important. I mean, nobody says that, but it's the first time that there is a war nearby a nuclear power installation. And therefore, there are no rules at all, no rules. And the Russian army is occupying this nuclear plant and playing some kind of new deterrence game. In fact, saying implicitly to the Ukrainian army, if you go forward in this area, anything could happen with this nuclear plant, which is a kind of new nuclear deterrence.
Yeah, and so that's one aspect of it. And I want to revisit this issue of fighter jets or no fighter jets, but first, let's go over. We saw in that report one of the people speaking with Catherine saying that there's not enough, that they're too close. The fact they're too close to the front line to have air defenses. In the pre-dawn hours of Tuesday, 18 missiles fired at Kyiv. 6 of those hypersonic Kinzhal or Dagger missiles seen here on display at a May Day parade in Moscow and touted as projectiles too fast to be intercepted. For at least the second time this month, Ukraine claims to have done just that. The Ukrainians' initial version was that they were 18 for 18 in shooting them down. Now, in the last minutes, Washington confirming that one Patriot missile system was damaged, but says it remains operational. Peter Zalmayev, where were you at 3 a.m. on Tuesday?
I was snugly in my bed sleeping, and then all hell broke loose. I mean, I've been in Kiev pretty much since the start of the war, and it had never been louder. It had never been, I mean, we had never had such spectacular fireworks over our skies. It felt literally, in fact, to everyone I know in the city, no matter where, it felt like it was happening right over your own rooftop. That's how immediate it was. And, it was so scary that you couldn't even approach the window to look out of it because you felt like the house was shaking, that at any moment you'll be just swept away with by a missile wave.
And what's the general mood where you are? Because you heard the triumphant words of the president afterwards saying, thanks to this Patriot system, we were able to take down these hypersonic missiles. But on the other hand, you just described for us the harrowing ordeal of being awoken in the middle of the night.
Well, I mean, it was probably the worst, like I said, of the war. But we are very jubilant over and very ecstatic over the fact that these Patriot systems are working and are working so effectively that I think the allies will be encouraged to provide Ukrainians with more. And, this is the best sort of advertisement. If we're speaking strictly, pragmatically and commercially, America and its allies will be able to sell Patriots by the dozens and hundreds. That's how effective they have been. And in fact, they've disproven one of Vladimir Putin's central propaganda, motivations, propaganda stance, that it has a wonder weapon of sorts. And Kinzhal is precisely that weapon that Vladimir Putin has considered impregnable and cannot be shot down. And this has just been disproven. So we're not, at this point, Ukrainians will tell you that, if Vladimir Putin wants to wage nuclear war against Ukraine, let it come. I mean, this is sort of the sort of fatalism we're feeling, mixed with an understanding that Russian army can be defeated, has been defeated, and will be defeated.
This comes back, Samantha de Bendern, to what you were talking about earlier about NATO piecemeal, giving not just airplanes, but tanks and other hardware, each time raising the stakes, but albeit very proceeding methodically. In the case of these Patriot anti-aircraft batteries, you just heard Peter say this is an amazing advertisement. Of course, NATO wanted to first wait, right, and see what the Russians had before deploying.
Well, I think there are a number of things. First of all, I mean, NATO is not homogenous. It's not actually NATO that is giving these weapons. It's NATO member states. So that's quite an important distinction to have. And each member state is taking its decisions based on what it has, what capacity it has to produce and to give weapons. Some weapons, for instance, the F-16s. Now, we've heard that the British and the Dutch want to get an international coalition together to give F-16s to Ukraine, but they can't do that without US authorizations because these are US planes. The same thing happened with the German Leopard tanks. Germany had to give authorization for the re-export of the tanks. So there has been a lot of bureaucracy involved. It hasn't just been a lack of will or lack of political decision-making. It's also been getting all these countries to agree what they can spare. Do they have enough ammunition? Do they have enough for their own defense? But again, one still has the sense that in spite of the bureaucratic obstacles, there has also been a kind of existential and ideological obstacle. How far do we go in helping Ukraine? When do we actually admit to ourselves, and that would be speaking as a Western policymaker, that this is a war, that we are in a way at war with Russia, even though nobody will admit it, not one single Western politician will admit it. I would say that this is exactly what is happening, and that defending Ukraine is not just about defending Ukraine, it's about defending Europe, because Europe is being attacked, European values are being attacked, and Putin has threatened other NATO member states on many occasions in his speeches. And I think people might need to start being a little bit more honest about that.
Yeah, we've seen certainly a change of tone. We had this Wednesday in Berlin, the Dutch and British who've been touting as leaders of that Jets coalition. The British, the UK defense minister making the trip to the German capital, speaking alongside his German counterpart, ruling out, though, the sale of British-made fighter planes, adding that if it's F-16s that Volodymyr Zelensky wants, well, that's up to Washington.
If you call it the fighter coalition, will be about saying, if anyone wants to do it, it's not for us to stand in their way, it's not our technology, we're happy to help, but our role could only be limited insofar as training and indeed coordination and indeed logistics.
So Claude Blanche-Maison, this fighters coalition, we woke up this morning with the radio stations talking about how this fighter jets coalition was being formed.
It's quite clear that Benoît and Pistorius are putting pressure together on the US, on Joe Biden, because they cannot do anything without the nodding, without the acceptance of the Americans. And up to now, Joe Biden has said, no, we are not going to transfer, and I'm not going to authorize the transfer of F-16. That's it. A certain number of European countries are ready to do it.
And they're already training pilots.
Well,
they say they're going to train
an intermediate stage. And even the French president say, we are going to take some pilots to train them.
Let's take a listen to Emmanuel Macron. He was asked in a Monday interview about this.
We opened the door to train pilots.
In France, train Ukraine pilots in France.
With several other European countries. I believe discussions are also underway with the Americans.
Starting when? On French aircrafts? On Mirage 2000? Is that something we can assume?
Training can start straight away.
So training for what? To use Rafales?
Well, our military people say that we don't have any plane to give to Ukraine. That's quite clear, because, I mean, we don't have any stocks of anything, of munitions, of ammunition, of planes, or anything else. But they say also that we have something like 20 Mirage, which is the former generation of fighter planes, which have been decommissioned, which have been stocked somewhere, and maybe we could sometimes, if the president decides to do so, hand over those 20-something Mirage, which would be, after all, something. But quite obviously, the president stressed the fact that the decision should be made by a coalition of countries, and in this coalition, of course, the Americans have the main say. So it should be a collective decision.
And would it be a good idea?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's too early to say, because obviously each time we were taking a new step to give armaments to Ukraine, everybody was very careful to test the Russian reaction. And the Russian reaction was very loud normally, but in the fact it was almost nothing, not real reaction. So for the plane, it's a big step. So maybe we are testing the reaction of the training of the pilots. There will be probably no real reactions. And then, of course, we will be on the wall. What shall we do? What shall we do? Shall we jump over the wall and give planes to Ukraine? Which is a big jump, because with planes, of course, you can go around your own country, but you can also fly over Russia, of course. And there is those part of Ukraine which have been annexed by Russia. Of course, it is Russian territory. And for us, it's not Russian territory. So those planes would be allowed, of course,
to fly over Crimea.
Of course, and to act over Crimea.
Before we turn to Catherine Norris-Trent, let's again look at the map of the front line, because Claude Blanche-Maison rightly pointing out what a long front line it is. Both sides have been targeting critical infrastructure behind those lines of late, using drones or long-range guided missiles for the most part. Catherine, you're hearing the discussion here in Paris. Planes or no planes? How fast? How slow? What's the feeling where you are on this?
I think the Ukrainians really hope that the West will give them fighter jets. I don't know if they're confident that will happen, and they certainly don't think it will happen quickly enough from those that I've been speaking to. You know, this talk of some kind of international coalition to procure fighter jets for Ukraine has got people talking. And they're saying, you know, at the beginning, the West was saying they didn't want to provide HIMARS with a range of 50 kilometers. And then they were saying that they didn't want to provide tanks. And then there's the question of these long-range missiles. And we've had these Storm Shadow missiles given by the UK to a great welcome here in Ukraine. And so I think perhaps people are hoping that this is going to be another of those turning points, although they don't expect it to come quickly enough. They think that they do need fighter jets long-term, though, even if they don't get them by the end of this year. People are asking, you know, what kind of future do they have living next door to Russia and having that kind of threat constantly on their borders? So there's a feeling that this is something that is very important to a lot of people. People do talk about this on the streets of Ukraine. Of course, it's impacting their daily lives, their security and their survival. There's interest, but perhaps not great optimism it will come soon.
Samantha de Better, we understand easily why Ukraine needs tanks, and a lot more than the ones that have been pledged so far, because the Russians have dug in with trenches, and you need to get over those trenches with armored vehicles. Why airplanes?
Because when you're doing an offensive operation, which is what Ukraine is now preparing, you need air cover. You need air cover to protect the troops on the ground. It's not to go and bomb Moscow. It's not to go and bomb St. Petersburg. It's to provide air cover for the troops on the ground. And also you have to remember the Russians have a significant air force, and when they're not crashing their own planes in their own territory, which they do seem to do, they would be capable of engaging in Ukraine and protecting their own troops in case of when they come under attack in the counteroffensive. Russians have not very engaged in a lot of their air force so far in this war. So
they're holding back.
They're holding back, and that is obviously something that Ukraine is aware of.
Why are they holding back?
Well, because they've actually been afraid of losing them because of Ukraine's more and more sophisticated air defense. You know, Ukraine has now downed, with thanks to the Patriot, the sort of the flagship of the Russian missile system, the Kinzhal, which is supposed to be a supersonic missile and unbeatable. Interesting thing, I read just before coming on the air that 3 of the designers of the Kinzhal have recently been arrested, allegedly for having published something in an Iranian journal about gas dynamics, had nothing to do with the Kinzhal, but the Russian Aeronautic Union of Aeronautic Engineers has actually just written an open letter to Putin complaining about the fact that they can't work properly because their top engineers are being arrested. Coincidentally, these are the people who designed the Kinzhal. So clearly something doesn't seem to be as good as one could hope with the Kinzhal.
What does these arrests mean? That these hypersonic missiles aren't what they were thought? Is it?
I don't know. I've literally just read it, but it is a very typical. It's what you saw during Stalin's time. You know, when things weren't going well at the front, senior officers would be arrested. People who didn't, if a weapon wasn't performing the way it was supposed to perform, people would be arrested. So someone is going to have to be blamed for the failure of these Kinzhals to perform the way they were supposed to perform. Because even the Russian Defense Ministry yesterday admitted that some Kinzhals had been thrown over Ukraine. They didn't admit that they had been downed, but they obviously didn't reach their target, so that means they were downed. So someone's going to have to take the fall for this. And it's not going to be Putin, and it's not going to be the high command yet. So first of all, you start by blaming the scientists.
Peter Zalman, you hear Samantha de Bender saying how the Russians have held back with their Air Force. They've still got some in the tank. Why did they hold back?
Well, they're holding back because, like Samantha has said, they've been increasingly vulnerable. The calculus has been changing in favor of Ukraine, even though Ukraine is still outgunned and outnumbered when it comes to sheer just number of artillery shells and soldiers, and Russia's seemingly bottomless appetite to see more and more of its soldiers die senselessly in the battle for Bakhmut. But Ukraine is more than making up for it with its sophisticated weaponry, such as the Patriot systems. Iris-T, which is unique, was provided by Germany, and it's the first time that it was ever tried in battle. So Vladimir Putin knows he's running out of this sophisticated weaponry, including these missiles. It takes a long time to reproduce them. Kinzhal, we hear the stocks are maybe down to a few dozen. So this is a significant problem. And Russia is still being squeezed due to sanctions. So that means that it has to go through very, complicated routes to get the chips necessary to produce this weapon. So it's doing pretty poorly, which is not to discount, once again, that it can still keep throwing cannon fodder at the Ukrainians. And let me just announce that today, according to Ukraine's official statement by the Ukraine's defense ministry, we reached a veritable milestone: 200,000 Russian soldiers dead in the war in Ukraine. 200,000. That's 10 times the number of soldiers who died in the war in Afghanistan from 79 to 89.
When you see the incremental gains claimed by Ukraine in the last days, Claude Blanche-Maison, what are your thoughts on what the Battle of Bakhmut, which has been likened to Verdun in World War I, is all about?
Yes, some similarity, but only some. I think Volodymyr Zelensky has been very courageous by deciding that the Ukrainian army should remain in Bakhmut, because some months ago, all the specialists, including in the US, were advising him to withdraw, to make a tactical withdrawal, because saying Bakhmut was not so important after all, it has no strategic importance, but he decided the opposite. And today he appears to be right, because the Ukrainian forces are winning ground, if in fact, on the north and on the south, even if in the city itself the Prigozhin people are making some progress from a few meters, in fact, very few things. But on the north, in the suburbs of Bakhmut, the Ukrainian army is making progress, which is good sign, and which gives some room of maneuver for Zelensky, but I'm not quite convinced that the big offensive, everybody's talking about it, will take place very soon. Because, as it has been said a while ago, it's very difficult to do it without proper planes, because you have to bomb.
That could be months away if you're waiting for pilots.
Exactly, and that's the crucial point, because to train pilots, it takes 3 months if they are already pilots of MiG or other Russian planes. But if they are trained from ground, from nothing, then it can take 1 year. And that is the problem. We don't know which kind of people are going to be handed to be trained, either in the US, either in UK, either in France or elsewhere.
Let's ask Catherine Norris-Trent about this. Is there the feeling, we've talked about it so much, that a counteroffensive is upon us?
Well, it's the million hryvnia question, isn't it, really? We talk about it every day. A lot of speculation. I can tell you the Ukrainians are, of course, preparing very seriously. We were filming with men from the territorial defense here in the south and the Zaporizhzhia front line near there today, and they're doing tactical assault training, and they're doing that every day at the moment. They've intensified that since the spring, and they're hoping that they will be able to push through soon. They also know, of course, about the very strong, Russian fortifications which have been built up behind the front lines. So you've got lines and lines of trenches, anti-tank trenches, and lots of mines. So it's going to be about air reconnaissance, trying to find the gaps in these defensive lines, trying to push through there. There's a bit of trepidation, I would say, but they're hoping that, some of the training the Ukrainian army's received in the West, some of their own training, tactics can get them through where they don't have air cover. So, they know they have to move soon, because if they don't move this summer or this autumn, then after that they lose their momentum. And there's also the risk, of course, that then they lose support from Western allies in terms of getting further weapons. So, the onus is upon them to act, and they are preparing at a pretty frantic pace. And there's the fog of war is very thick, so no one, of course, will say when or where, or if it's going to be on several fronts, and we'll just have to wait and see. I mean, it's in serious preparation.
There's serious preparation, you're saying. Samantha de Bender, you heard Catherine Norris-Trent there saying there is a window right now. If that window passes, if, as Claude Blanche-Maison warns, it could be a summer or a fall offensive instead of a spring counteroffensive, then it could be too late for Ukraine to keep their momentum. But you won't have the pilots and the planes in time.
Well, I think everyone's been hearing similar rumors for the past 2 months that fighter pilots have been being trained on F-16s for a while. I mean, Rishi Sunak said so the other day when Zelensky was in the UK. The US have said that they have taken at least 2 fighter pilots already quite a few months ago to start training them on F-16s. If you think of the way the Storm Shadow was announced by the British late last week, no, earlier on this week, I'm getting confused with my timings here, and they announced that the Storm Shadow was going to be given to Ukraine, that the MiG-29s that were going to be carrying the Storm Shadow had already been modified to be able to carry these missiles because they're air-to-surface missiles. So my gut feeling is if F-16s are being talked about so much now, that something has been in preparation for a while. And I'd just like to remind viewers of what happened when the Americans decided to give the Abrams tanks. They did so under pressure from the Europeans. And I suspect that the Europeans are putting pressure on the US right now. What is holding things back is probably a number of things. The US now has a really big issue dealing with whether it's debt ceiling and what's going to happen on that.
I was going to say, because that Patriot missile system that got damaged, what is it, one of those batteries is worth $1.1 billion?
That's what I understand. Maybe Ambassador Blanche-Maison has better figures than I do. And so
It's
and the
expensive,
US,
and that's not a plane. That's just an anti.
Exactly. And there's also, the US is also going into the pre-election period very, very soon. By the autumn, the whole of the US body politic will be thinking about the next elections. So the window is now not only in terms of the terrain in Ukraine and the weather, but also in terms of international support, which is also why Ukraine does not want to botch this counteroffensive, why whatever happens is going to have to be done at the right time, at the right place, and with the right amount of fog to make sure nobody knows what is going on until it's already started.
Let's stay on this issue of fog of war, or certainly how things are being pitched, because a week ago at this time, we were obsessing about the backstabbing and infighting between the Russian Defense Ministry, the irregulars of Wagner. Since then, the Washington Post has claimed that Wagner's boss, Yevgeny Prigozhin, tried to negotiate the location of the positions of the enemy in exchange for a pullout from Bakhmut. The New York Times this Wednesday warning against overplaying the problems inside the Kremlin, saying that prizing loyalty above all else, Mr. Putin appears prepared to stomach sniping among his war leaders, as long as it doesn't threaten him personally. Among Russia's elite, business leaders appear to have grown accustomed to the idea of years-long war and have adapted supply chains accordingly. This as they adapt as well their own consumption and travel patterns. We've been talking so much about the theater and drama inside of the Kremlin Claude Blanche Maison. Again, are we perhaps underestimating Russia's resilience despite it all?
It's possible. We don't know. But it's quite clear that Putin himself is prepared to go with a very long war. He has no problem with that because he's convinced that at the very end, Russia has the resilience, has the resources, human resources, even if it's difficult to manage them, if there are some resistance. But he is convinced that he can support a long war, and probably at the very end, because it changed his game. In fact, it changed also the aim of the war, and now probably he would be satisfied with just taking his profit from what the part of Ukraine he has annexed, of course, which is absolutely unacceptable for Ukraine and for the West. So, which means that he is prepared to have a frozen conflict, like it is in Georgia. In Georgia, I think the frozen conflict is on about 20% of the ground of Georgia. Today, we are about 20% of the Ukraine territory occupied by Russia, even annexed by Russia. And probably he would be prepared to go with its solution, with it completely unacceptable for the West, quite clear. So I think that's probably why there will be a big explanation at the NATO summit on the 12th of July in Vilnius. Vilnius is not very far from Kiev. And I'm convinced that this time the president of Ukraine he will go himself. It
won't be by video link. Peter Zalmayev, you were talking to us about the Ukraine government's claim that the death toll on the Russian side had passed to 200,000. But as you said yourself earlier, Russia's a big place. They can keep going.
Well, yeah, indeed, they can keep going, and it seems that Vladimir Putin, is constantly tightening the screws on whatever remains of civil society in Russia. It's increasingly resembles 1937, the heyday of Stalin's repression. Already there's a system of electronic forms that you receive to be recruited into the army. You're notified through electronic mail that you have to report for duty, and you cannot claim later that you have not seen it. Having said that, Vladimir Putin, is presiding over, like you said, an increasingly disparate set of factions. There's a lot of backstabbing and infighting, and the New York Times article, which you referred to, does mention that this is something of Vladimir Putin's kind of, beloved strategy to keep various factions of the Kremlin fighting with each other and competing. And it does work in times of peace, but it's not so great for a military strategy when there's this constantly rotating roster of generals and the commanders-in-chief. And so that has been reflected in the battlefield. So no matter how much fresh cannon fodder Vladimir Putin keeps throwing at this war, the Russian army is bleeding, quality trained officers, especially junior officers, very important rank in the army. Thousands of them have already perished. They've been like senior officers who have also perished. So this is a matter of not just quantity, but quality. But having said that, once again, Vladimir Putin does have ways to keep this dragging on for a long time. And I think he's got all the motivation to. I would even venture to say that for as long as Vladimir Putin is alive and is in power, which I think is also one and the same, he will be interested in dragging this out endlessly and will actually die a wartime president, because stopping it at this point would be a supremely risky move for a Russian leader. No Russian leader in recent history has lost a war and been able to keep power.
Samantha de Bender?
Yeah, I agree with that.
So you disagree with Claude Blanche-Maison that he'd be happy with a frozen conflict?
No, well, first of all, there will not be a frozen conflict because the Ukrainians will not freeze the conflict. The Poles, the Poles will not freeze the conflict. The Baltics won't freeze the conflict. So I don't believe in this scenario of a frozen conflict. Insofar as Putin, I don't think that while Putin is alive and in power, we will see an end to the war in Ukraine. One thing that's really interesting to notice is that there is this, and the New York Times article explains it, that Putin likes to divide and rule, and that works in business. It doesn't work when you're conducting a military campaign. But you have now approximately, according to some estimates by some Russian academics, around 40 private armies today in Russia. The Wagner Group is the most well-known one. You have private armies that belong to private enterprises, that belong to oligarchs, that belong to regional governors, that belong to different ministries and different ministers in ministries. Gazprom has 3 private armies. These armies are all...
But is that just for protecting installations, or are they fighting in Ukraine?
A lot of them are fighting in Ukraine now. They're all fighting for the same limited pile of ammunitions. You have private armies fighting amongst themselves for ammunitions, selling men to each other. Now, if this is not a fertile ground for some kind of civil war, or I would call it more an elite war, an elite grab for power, I don't believe in a popular uprising, but in an intra-elite war with men who are well-armed, badly trained, some of them going home traumatized and still armed, this does not look good for Russia.
Claude Blanche-Maison?
Could happen. It's a very optimistic hypothesis. I'm not so optimistic than that.
Well, I'm not at all optimistic.
I fear that we have to live, unfortunately, with the Putin gang for some time again, because maybe he's sick, but then, therefore, we cannot make any assumption on that. Maybe he has some opposition inside Kremlin, but we cannot grant any assumption on that, because, in fact, he has been building a network like in a gang, in fact. He's the head of the gang, and he's controlling everybody. I mean, the elite does not exist anymore. The best of the elite has flown away. They are outside Russia, and they don't exist anymore. That's why Navalny decided to go in jail, to go back to Russia, to be in jail, and to be a very visible figure. But, I mean, the other ones, nobody talk about them anymore once they have been abroad. So I think, of course, a coup may happen sometime, but it's not the most probable hypothesis. First of all, there is no tradition of coup within the army. This state is a FSB, KGB.
They tried in 91.
Well,
they failed, but they did try.
Yes, they failed. In fact, the FSB ex-KGB is controlling everything. so it could come only from the FSB. But I don't think that the FSB has any interest to overthrow Putin and to create.
Before we go, we're braced on both sides for full-on battle, for more full-on battle than there is already. And that's raising fears around the globe that Europe's breadbasket might be shut to grain and fertilizer exports to the developing world. Turkey's president was the one first to announce this Wednesday an 11th-hour deal to extend that agreement that allows both Russia and Ukraine to sail ships through the Black Sea and export grains. There are those risking their lives at the front and those risking their lives for their livelihoods. Catherine Norris-Trent, you were just a few days back in the Mykolaiv region and spoke with farmers who told you, and in fact showed you, that they had to plow despite the risk of mines.
Yeah, I mean, there are a huge number of land mines, so anti-tank, anti-personnel mines, and unexploded munitions, or some of them exploded, lying in the prime agricultural land in southern Ukraine. And so a lot of the fields are left untended. Other farmers, small farmers usually, who financially just can't keep going with not, ploughing their land, have tried to demine by themselves. There's been a lot of injuries, quite a few deaths as well. One Ukrainian official said up to 185 civilians, so we don't know whether that includes farmers or other civilians as well, have been killed by exploding munitions and landmines. And people are taking it into their own hands and going out and farming, and they're finding huge amounts of metal in the land, and the emergency services can't get round quickly enough to demine it. It will take years. And so this grain deal, while it keeps the ships going for now, it does, there's a huge longer term problem about the quantity of cereals not being produced for the second year in a row. Those cereals just aren't being planted and harvested in the quantities which they were. Ukraine was the world's fourth largest grain exporter, and so for the moment, they're shipping things out of the silos in southern Ukraine, but future crops, so this is going to keep going for years to come.
Years to come will be the problem will last with us, even if there was some magical quick solution to what's unfolding where you are. Catherine Norris-Trent, thank you so much for joining us from Zaporizhzhia. Peter Zalmayev in Kyiv. I want to thank Samantha de Bender and Claude Blanche-Maison. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.